Hello, in this video we'll talk about hormones of the pancreas, and this video is dedicated for CBSE NEET UG aspirants, and this concept is from class 11 NCERT book chapter number 22. So let's begin. Pancreas is a composite gland which can act as both exocrine as well as endocrine gland. If we cut a cross section of the pancreas, we would have a view like this. Here, these regions are marked as exocrine part or the pancreatic acini, and it secretes enzymes. And the part in the middle is endocrine part, and this is the solely responsible for hormone secretion. The endocrine part consists of islets of Langerhans. Now these endocrine parts are dispersed all throughout the pancreas, and there are about 1 to 2 million of such islets of Langerhans. But for simplicity, I am showing only one. And there are several cell types in the islets of Langerhans. In this video, we'll talk about all these cell types and the hormones which are secreted by these cell types. So let's begin. Again, cutting a cross section from the pancreas, and we can see there are several cell types. First of all, there is pancreatic beta cell. The major function of beta cell is to secrete insulin. Pancreatic alpha cell secretes glucagon, and delta cells secrete somatostatin. In a moment, we'll talk about all the functions of these hormones. Now let's talk about insulin first, because insulin is one of the major peptide hormone in the body, which is master regulator for metabolism. So insulin is a peptide type hormone, and insulin is major regulator of glucose homeostasis. Obviously, we have mentioned earlier that it is secreted by the beta cells. The big job of insulin is to localize glucose or mobilize glucose from blood to several tissues like liver or like adipose tissues. Now the question is, after mobilizing of these glucose, how does liver utilize the glucose? So once insulin helps the glucose to be mobilized to the liver hepatocytes, glucose gets converted to glucose 6-phosphate, and ultimately it forms pyruvate. So you know this pathway, this is glycolysis. Eventually, from pyruvate, Krebs cycle would take place and ATP would be generated in the long run. After that, if glucose level is pretty high, then some amount of glucose would be stored as glycogen. So glycogenesis would take place. Then some amount of glucose can be converted to glucose 6-phosphate, and that could be channeled into pentose phosphate pathway. And pentose phosphate pathway lead to production of NADPH, and NADPH is a key reductive equivalent that is used in several biochemical pathways like fatty acid biosynthesis, like protein biosynthesis, and many more. So NADPH is really crucial. Just like we have energy currency as ATP, NADPH is basically reducing equivalent. So now we understand how hepatocyte would utilize the glucose. Adipocyte would also utilize the glucose, but it would convert glucose to acetyl-CoA eventually, and then acetyl-CoA would be converted to malonyl-CoA, and in subsequent step, ultimately fatty acids would be generated. In short, when there is too much of glucose, adipocytes convert glucose into fat and store the fat for future usage. Now let us zoom into one pancreatic beta cell to understand how insulin is produced. Insulin is polypeptide type of hormone, so it is encoded by insulin gene, and insulin is formed as a immature polypeptide. It is known as proinsulin, which is cleaved by several convertase enzymes and carboxypeptidase. And after cleavage, insulin is now mature. Now these insulins remain inside vesicles, so they are already packaged inside the vesicles and they are ready to be released. Now whenever some stimulus comes in, beta cell secretes the insulin, and this stimulus is glucose level elevation. So wherever there is a glucose level elevation, insulin is released. Now let's say we have consumed an ice cream, and obviously after consumption of ice cream our blood glucose level would be super high. Now in this situation, insulin would be secreted from the pancreatic beta cell, and pancreatic beta cell knows to secrete insulin because glucose level has been elevated. Now insulin would act on this glucose, and eventually insulin would help this glucose to be mobilized inside tissues like muscle, and muscle would utilize this glucose for production of energy, or let's say it can also store it for future. It can store it in format of glycogen. Now we understood that there are two types of hormones produced by pancreas, at least two major types. We are kind of ignoring the somatostatin because it's not in NCERT and not mentioned in details. So the major hormones from pancreatic alpha and beta cells are glucagon and insulin. Both of these has huge role on glucose metabolism. Key goal of glucagon is to increase glucose level in the blood, and glucagon is secreted when glucose level is low, whereas insulin is secreted when glucose level is high. So the sole goal for glucagon is to increase the glucose level, whereas the sole goal for insulin is to decrease the glucose level in the blood. Now let's try to understand what are the metabolic functions that glucagon and insulin plays, and these metabolic functions are kind of opposite. So if we talk about glycolysis, glucagon positively regulates glycolysis, whereas insulin negatively regulates it. If we think about glycogenolysis, that means breakdown of glycogen, glucagon promotes breakdown, whereas insulin promotes the anabolism of glycogen. That means formation of glycogen is favored by insulin, because if you make glycogen, then blood glucose level would be eventually lowered. If we talk about glycogenesis, glucagon discourages glycogenesis, whereas insulin encourages. If we think about neoglucogenesis or gluconeogenesis, glucagon promotes gluconeogenesis, whereas insulin prevents gluconeogenesis. So overall, insulin negatively regulates glucose metabolism, like it decreases blood glucose level, and glucagon kind of positively regulates glucose metabolism, and it increases blood glucose level. And this is super important concept. Okay, now we clearly understand that insulin drives the rapid movement of glucose from blood to hepatocytes or adipocytes. So when insulin helps in the movement of glucose, it leads to lowering the glucose level in the blood, and this leads to a state called hypoglycemia. Hypo means lower and glycemia means status of glucose in the blood. So lower blood glucose level is referred as hypoglycemia. But when insulin is not present, there could be hyperglycemia, because the glucose cannot be moved to hepatocytes or let's say adipocytes for their utilization. As a result, blood glucose level stays elevated for long time, and this leads to diabetes mellitus. Diabetes is a nasty disease, right? Because in diabetes you can have glucose not cleared from the blood, and the rest of the glucose is hence excreted with the urine, and this situation is known as glucosuria. That means presence of glucose in the urine. Now prolonged diabetes can also lead to ketoacidosis. That means it leads to generation of ketone bodies, right? And that can change the pH of the blood, and hence it can acidify the blood and leads to a condition known as ketoacidosis. So these are some harmful effects of prolonged elevated blood glucose level and diabetes. So that pretty much summarizes all the concepts provided in the NCERT textbook. So as per summary, let me remind you that we have learned about endocrine pancreas and the pancreatic hormones. We learned about what type of cells secrete what type of hormones, how insulin and glucagon works. We discussed this part in detail, especially in context of glucose metabolism. And lastly, we kind of touched upon diabetes and ketoacidosis. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this video, give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. You can check out my social media links in the description and feel free to comment.